The Historical Society of Ottawa acknowledges that as we share these stories from our past, we are on what remains the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. This series is a collaboration between the Historical Society of Ottawa and Rogers TV. I'm Ben Weiss. I'm with the Historical Society of Ottawa, where we've been telling Ottawa's great stories since 1898. If you find Ottawa history as fascinating as we do, I urge you to check out our website, our monthly speaker series, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And enjoy today's segment.
Hi, I'm Jim Hurcomb, and thanks a lot for having me this afternoon as part of this really exciting series about Ottawa history. And talking about rock and roll might be a little bit different than talking about big canals and things like that. But in my estimation, cultural history of Ottawa is just as important as the physical history. And that's not the reason I wrote these two books. I'll hold them up quickly if I may. Rockin' on the Rideau 1, Ottawa's Golden Age of Rock and Roll. This covers 1955 to 1970. And Volume 2 came out after that unexpectedly, and it's called cleverly Volume 2, Rockin' on the Rideau, the 70s. And this one covers 1970 to 1980. A labor of love. I've grown up in music since I can remember. All facets of music, listening to the radio when I was a kid, especially late at night during the 1960s when there were all these cool late night radio shows on that started at 10 o'clock, which was way past my bedtime. But I had what was called a rocket radio, a little transistor in the form of a rocket ship. And the antenna on the top was like the antenna of a spaceship. It was very cool. And better still, it had a little earplug that got to be very waxy over the years, but at night I go under the covers when I was supposed to be sleeping and listen to rock and roll radio. The more, well, to me anyway, the more exciting, adventurous music came on after 10 o'clock after the pop was finished. I grew up here in Ottawa, went to Rideau High School, started playing drums when I was in grade 9, so again that whole musical angle followed me right through my life, got involved in bands, etc. And just became a rock and roll fanatic, especially after the Beatles arrived in 1964. But let's push the story back just a little bit, and if I may, I'd like to read just a short passage from the first book, The Forward. We talk about what the scene in Ottawa was like musically back in 1964, 1965, when the Beatles arrived and before then. While the world was swinging to the British beat, Ottawa was riding a rock and roll wave of its own. About half the population of Ottawa in 1964 was under 25, and these kids had money. Of course, the first wave of the baby boom. And they wanted their own culture. They were sick of what their parents were watching on TV or listening to on the radio or on the record player. They wanted something of their own. And in great numbers, they gather at school and in the quintessential malt shops to talk about what mattered to them: clothes, boys, girls, and music. And in 1964, that all, I guess, convalesced around the Beatles, who appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964. And again, back to the book. At the time, Ottawa was known as a sleepy government town, a town that fun forgot. We had the Parliament buildings, the Rideau Canal, the Ottawa Rough Riders were great back then, but little else when it came to our own identifiable culture. But after that, when rock and roll came and kids picked up their rock and roll instruments, it seemed that music was everywhere, church basements, in clubs, in drive-ins, everywhere. When the Beatles arrived, rock and roll arrived in Ottawa. Although going back a bit further to 1957, there was kind of a spurt in that year when a fairly famous rock and roll star came to town. His name, you might have heard of him, Elvis Presley. And now, if you see the Elvis Presley movie that came out recently, there's a real factual mistake in it when one of the characters talks about Elvis Presley never playing a concert outside the United States and Hawaii. Well, he did. He played 3 cities outside of North America. The reason was, apparently, Colonel Tom Parker was Dutch of origin, but he came over to America illegally. He evaded the draft, and then he deserted the army. He was on a very bad list, and if anyone caught him in the States or trying to travel anywhere else in the world, he'd be sent home, and he might face some charges there. That was a rumor. So Colonel Tom made sure to stay really put in North America, in the United States, along with his protege, Elvis Presley. But of course, there was a huge demand for Elvis, and a small Canadian tour was lined up in 1957. Now, 1957 for Elvis Presley, this was the year. He just signed a major movie deal, a major record deal with RCA Records. He'd been on the Ed Sullivan Show with the famous shot above the waist appearance. So Elvis Presley was at the peak of his powers in 1957. He was supposed to play 3 cities: Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. Well, Ottawa's not on that list, so how did it happen that he came to Ottawa? Well, thank the Roman Catholic Church for that. A very powerful entity in Montreal, and they wanted nothing to do with this devil's disciple, Elvis Presley. So the show in Montreal was canceled, and now there was an opening. And sure enough, Ottawa, just down the railroad tracks, on the way to Toronto, and Elvis Presley was booked for 2 shows here in Ottawa at the old auditorium. The YMCA downtown now sits on that site. Top ticket price, $3. It sold out. There are about 7,000 kids there, and the people I've talked to in the book about that concert say you couldn't hear a damn thing. The people screaming, the girls yelling. There's some great shots at the Ottawa Archives of Elvis Presley here in Ottawa, and they generously let me use some here in the book. It was mayhem, and he had brought his pink Cadillac, the whole 9 yards, and that was really when Ottawa did rock and roll did arrive in Ottawa. And again, many musicians I talked to from bands like the Playdates, the Imperials, the High Tones, and others who were playing kind of very bland white rock and roll at the time said the next day they all started adding Elvis Presley songs to the repertoire, and bands started playing more of a rock and roll kind of sound than they did before Elvis came. So he changed things not only in North America and around the world, but here in Ottawa in 1957. After Elvis, the sound of rock and roll changed in Ottawa. Even the bands that were around before Elvis started adapting their sound to what was popular and heard on the radio, etc. So the period 1957 to 1960 or so was pretty vibrant here when it came to rock and rollers. Huey Scott was another great example of an early rockabilly guy who got out there and dressed like Elvis. And he told me anyway that the girls chased him into the washroom when he went to see Elvis at the auditorium because they thought it might be him. So they reveled in this kind of notoriety. But rock and roll in general took a bit of a dive, a real dive in 1960. Elvis had been drafted. He was in Germany in the army. Chuck Berry was in jail. Jerry Lee Lewis married his 13-year-old cousin, so he was blackballed. Little Richard gave up rock and roll. So basically the mainstays of rock and roll abandoned the genre, or the genre abandoned them by 1960, and music went back to being really kind of safe. The girl singers in their frilly dresses singing about, oh, I want a boy, I need a boy, and the boys with usually the first name Bobby, and the nice white teeth and the beautiful hair. They were turning up pop hits left and right, and radio went along with that. So to all intents and purposes, rock and roll in 1963 or 62 was pretty dead, aside from, say, the Beach Boys having some success and Bob Dylan coming up. That changed in February of 1964 when a band called the Beatles hit the shores of North America, New York City specifically, landed at JFK Airport, newly named for the slain American president who died just months before the Beatles arrived. There might be a correlation there between the death of Kennedy and the arrival of this brand new exciting group called the Beatles, and like a new start, especially for a lot of kids. They appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. It was a record number of people watching it. The record was not broken, I think, till Seinfeld's finale. But everyone was watching that night, including a huge audience here in Ottawa on that Sunday night. And again, there's stories. I talked to a band called the 5D, one of the top Ottawa bands of that time. And he told me, Dave Poulin told me, that he and a buddy were on the phone in the commercial break after the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. and they talked about starting a band. We got to do this. Did you see? Are you watching this? This is incredible. Look at those girls screaming. Everyone's going crazy. We got to start a rock and roll band. The late Les Emerson of the Staccatos and the 5-man electrical band was doing a gig that night with the Huey Scott band, I believe, at the Chaudière Hotel on the other side of the river. And he told me that they made sure their break came while the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, and they had the same feeling. They're doing original material, they're dressed differently, they're playing rock and roll. It's a different kind of combo or band setup. And sure enough, they got together with a guy named Vern Craig, and Vern Craig and Les Emerson started the Staccatos, one of the first bands here in Ottawa. So virtually overnight, and I remember it well because I went out and combined money with my brother and sister. We each put in $1 and bought the first Beatle record called Beatlemania here in Canada at the local IGA for $3. And that was the big thrill. And then came the lunch boxes, the Beatle wigs, the whole thing. And Beatlemania hit Ottawa as hard as it hit any city in North America or the world. And really, as some people said, the world went from black and white to color the night that the Beatles went on Ed Sullivan. Everything changed. And it was a very exciting time to be part of the rock and roll scene here in Ottawa. My biggest thrill, I think, about writing this book was talking to the musicians who played in bands before the Beatles arrived, before Elvis arrived. Bands like the High Tones were a great example, the Jive Rockets another. And some of the musicians I talked to were well into their 80s. And I tracked them down and called them and told them what I wanted to do. And one stands out for me in particular. He said, well, I'm 87 years old now, and it was so long ago. I don't think I'll remember a lot of this stuff, but if you're willing to put up with me, I'll do the interview. So we started the interview. About an hour and a half later, he stopped talking. The more he went on, his voice got younger. The memories came back of that exciting time of being in a band, being here in Ottawa, and playing for people, dancing, and the excitement of Elvis, the excitement of the Beatles. And this was his life. And even though he maybe forgot parts of it, it still is a big part of his life. Another local guy I gave the book to from a band in the early 60s, he's right now housebound, and so I brought the book over to him and signed it for him. We had a nice chat, and he started looking through it, and the tears started to come. And I was wondering, what's wrong? Is he not feeling well? No, it was the memories coming back. And I think when you talk about that period and the bands, you talk about the venues, you talk about the performers who came to town. And if you were growing up in the 60s here in Ottawa, the memories will come back as vividly as they did to these guys. This is where you grew up. This is where your gang grew up. This is where you became part of the youth culture here in Ottawa. And music was the thing that bound everything together. It was, have you heard the new Beatles record? Talking about going to school and chatting with your friend about the Beatles. Or my favorite, the Dave Clark 5. Oh, they're on Ed Sullivan tonight. I can't wait to see that. The Rolling Stones came along and put a different kind of flavor into rock and roll. They didn't wear the suits. They didn't look like they showered in a while. But they were out there playing basic blues, rock and roll. And again, we had, I guess, our first split in rock and roll. Did you like the Beatles or did you like the Rolling Stones? And it tended to be girls like the Beatles, guys like the Stones, and the Who and the Kinks and all these bands. And that was reflected locally too with the groups that we had. Stuck kind of halfway between Toronto and Montreal. Montreal was more a Stones kind of town, and Toronto loved the Beach Boys, the vocal bands, the R&B bands they heard from across the river. And here in Ottawa, we were kind of a combination of the two. We had bands that were really, really tight on harmonies, the Staccatos, the Esquires, the Townsmen. These bands still sound fresh today. And then we had the true rock and roll bands patterned after the Rolling Stones, the Scallywags, the Scoundrels, and to some extent the 5D, and others who were more, in-your-face kind of scowling things and creating mayhem wherever they played. The lead singer of the Scoundrels told me that they were playing church basements to 1,500 kids, capacity supposedly 400. And the fire marshals would come and they'd look around and then they'd make sure that the doors were clear, and then they let the kids be kids. But 1,000 kids paying to get in to see local bands here in a church basement. And this happened right across town. And these venues became popular along with places like Pineland and the Oak Door down on Bank Street, the more traditional clubs that were booking in rock and roll bands as well. People like Ronnie Hawkins and his backup band, who became The Band many years later with Robbie Robertson. The Midtown Ballroom was one of the traditional dance spots here in Ottawa before rock and roll. It didn't last long after the rock and rollers came, and Britannia would have the big band still on Saturday nights under the stars. So it was a really eclectic music scene once the Beatles landed. And there are just so many things to talk about, and that's why the book was such a joy. I did not set out to write a book. I'm not a writer. I've been in radio here in Ottawa since 1973 or so. And I've done some writing for national and local publications on music. And one of the series for a magazine called Bounder Magazine here, I flew the idea of maybe doing a feature on some of the big local bands of the 60s, the Staccatos and the Esquires. And these went down so well and were so well received, and I had such a kick talking to people like Les Emerson and Gary Como from the Esquires, and these local legends who have kind of been forgotten, to tell you the truth, over the years. And it was such a joy to talk to these people and feel the passion they had for the music. I kept the tapes, and after these magazine articles were successful, I sort of thought, there might be something more in this. Let's put this down and maybe write a short book on this. And I decided right away to make sure it's in the words of the musicians. It's not me trying to pontificate about all this stuff. I was kind of the conductor for the train, and the passengers were the ones who told the stories. Not only the musicians, but the fans, the radio guys, and just people who were kind of on the fringe of the music business here in Ottawa, sound people, engineers, writers, the whole gamut of people. And it tells a really vivid story. That's what I like about the feedback for the book. It's not that it's a great piece of writing. I don't think it is. It's just conversational, but it's real writing. It, to the best of my ability, we've been able to cobble together these stories and these people to tell us what it was like in the 60s. If you weren't there, you're going to be envious. And if you were there, the memories it brings back, even the covers, and people look at it and go, I remember that guy. He was in the Esquires. I saw them down at Pineland like every Saturday. We'd have to park a mile away down, I think it was on River Road or Riverside, and to line up to get in to see these guys. It was that vivid a scene and that rockin' a scene. And being a radio guy, talking to people, again, if you've lived during that period, you know who Gord Atkinson was on CFRA. He hosted the Campus Club, a nightly show for the kids. And Al Pussycat Pascal and his cast of characters. And sadly, Gord's passed away, but Pussycat Pascal is still with us, and there's a great picture in, I think, the second book of Al on the beach in Florida reading the first book. And what a character. And these people worked so hard, and to compare them to today's disc jockey, you just can't. Back then, they were given so much free rein and leash to do inventive things, to do funny voices, to play new music, to steal new music from American radio stations who got these songs first by tuning them in and putting their tape machines in front of the radio speakers, recording the song, running into the studio and saying, hey, I've got an exclusive for you. Pardon the hiss on this. And playing the latest from the Beatles or the Stones or some new bands we haven't heard of here in Canada yet. And most importantly, radio disc jockeys and radio stations supported local music. And that was a key to moving these bands up from just starting up and being like local musicians to being, oh, these guys are local celebrities. And after that, oh, these guys have a national hit and they're from Ottawa and we're going to play the crap out of it. And bands like the ones we've talked about so far were always in the top 40 here in Ottawa on the charts. You might have 7 or 8 local bands. You'd have a band like the Townsmen at #1 in Ottawa, ahead of the Beatles. And to kids hearing this band's #1, we got to go out and see them. They're better than the Beatles. Well, they weren't better than the Beatles, but they were darn good, and they were getting the exposure on radio and in newspaper. One of my favorite characters, because I grew up reading them every week in the Ottawa Journal. It's a guy named Sandy Gardner. I think he was born in Scotland, lived a lot of his life in England, and he was a music writer over there in the early 1960s. And at that time, we had bands like the Beatles, the Stones, playing clubs over there. And he would follow these groups. And when he emigrated to Canada and started to write, he maintained those contacts and started writing about these new bands. Before the Beatles hit big, they were talked about in his column, which was called Platter, Chatter, and Idle Patter every week. And he came up with a term in 1963 on the success of the Beatles. He said, you know, let's just call it what it is. It's Beatlemania. And legend has it that's the first time that term was ever used was by an Ottawa journalist in the Ottawa Journal circa 1963. And that was also used by Capitol Records as the title for the first Beatles album here in Canada. It was called Beatlemania, with a quote from Sandy Gardner on the front. I think it was called Meet the Beatles, most other places. As was the case back then, albums varied not only in title but in content from country to country. But Beatlemania here in Canada, that's the album. I've got a couple of copies at home, and that's the one we all ran out to buy and kicked off Beatlemania here in Canada. And those records were pressed in Smiths Falls, which a lot of people don't know. That was one of the biggest record pressing plants in North America. And again, legend has it, or people I've talked to, said late some nights you could see trains pulling out of the train station in Smiths Falls heading south with kind of illegal copies of the Canadian version of Beatlemania because it was pressed on better vinyl and sounded better and became a huge get for collectors down in the United States. Again, that's a story I'd never heard before, and doing the research and talking to people, it was so easy because they had all these stories, not only about their bands but about so-and-so. Or they'd say, hey, you got to talk to High Bloom. I think he's still alive. Now, High Bloom was old back in the 60s, and he was the first, let's say, record engineer, producer here in Ottawa. He had a small studio down on Somerset Street, right near Bank. And all the bands would go to High Bloom's studio to record. Again, when you compare it to modern studios, it wasn't much, a couple of tape reels and microphones and things, and open windows because it got stuffy in there. But he set up a microphone in his window so he could hear when the streetcar was coming. He could hear the clang clang in the distance, and when he heard the train coming, he stopped the studio, the session, because he didn't want the clanging going on behind the musicians. And the kid who used to deliver snacks to the band was a young kid named Paul Anka. His folks owned a restaurant just down the street, and we know what happened with Paul Anka. As you can see, I've got lots of stories in here, a bit jumbled sometimes, but it was just such a period. Every day something was happening. New bands were coming to town. New local bands were forming, breaking up, splitting off into new groups, and it was just such a fertile scene. As I mentioned, bands were playing everywhere. There were few restaurants in town that didn't have rock and roll after hours. Spaghetti houses had it. They'd clear the room and then open the doors to the kids outside and bring in a rock and roll band. Drive-ins and movie theaters had rock bands between shows. As I said, it was everywhere, not only the clubs. And this continued right throughout the 60s, and bands like the Staccatos evolved. They became the five-man electrical band. You've probably heard of them and their big song Signs from 1971, and that kicks off part of book number 2 on the 70s, and the rise of the five-man electrical band, the Cooper Brothers, Octavian, all these bands that played your high school. Barrymore's opened up in the late 1970s. It turned from a disco hall and a strip club into the best rock and roll venue in the country. The Ottawa Civic Centre opened for rock bands in 1967. All these clubs, all these bands, all these memories, and I'm just glad I got a chance to put a lot of it down on paper. You can't do everything, of course. Some bands are forgotten, but we made a list of concert venues and bands coming to town. Led Zeppelin. There was one show at the Civic Centre I remember well with Alice Cooper, Black Sabbath, and Yes on the same bill. The Eagles played an outdoor show here in Ottawa. The Arrival of Punk ends off the second book. Will there be a third? I'm not really sure. The first two were a lot of work, but a lot of fun. And with so many of these musicians, Les Emerson, Richard Patterson, passing away recently, the radio people as well, and others into their 80s and 90s, we had to tell this story now or it wasn't going to get told. And I'm glad I had the opportunity to write these 2 books, the Rocking on the Rideau series. And they're in pretty well every library in town. They're at Books on Beechwood has copies now. And again, it was my pleasure doing it. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. It was such a success to do. And there might be a volume 3, but again, to all the musicians and people who helped me out on this, Harvey Glatt was a great contributor to this, the father of Ottawa popular music. And again, for all of you who've played rock and roll, you've recorded rock and roll, or if you've just gone out to see a band or 2 and supported them and bought their music, for those who rocked on the Rideau, I salute you and thank you very much for the time this afternoon with the Historical Society. It's been a lot of fun, and keep rocking, keep supporting local music. Thanks.